Hello and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give people a minute or two to join and then get kicked off. Okay, I think we can get started. A respectable 1 minute over the start point of this webinar. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're really pleased to have you today. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers. So you will be hearing from me, Samira Brophy. I am a senior director in our creative excellence team, and our creative excellence team leads everything to do with marketing effectiveness and creative excellence. I will be doing some scene setting alongside my colleague.
So my name is Matt. I am the Insight Lead for Ipsos Iris. So for those unfamiliar on the call, Iris is the only UCOM endorsed, that's the UK online measurement body, then a UCOM endorsed and multi-award winning online audience measurement solution in the UK. Always worth dropping that in. In a nutshell, it means we measure and report on what people do online. If it's taking place on a smartphone, a laptop, a PC, or a tablet, we should be reporting on it. Keeping it succinct, we do that through a combination of our online panel of over 10,000 adults in the UK and census data, so essentially tags on some of the biggest sites and apps also in the UK. This all gets fused together and surfaced in our UI, along with some very rich and granular profiling data, and that allows our clients to pull out detailed data on what people are doing online. What are they doing? Where are they doing? Where are they doing it? And how are they doing it? The likes of which was used in this presentation today.
Fabulous. So thank you again for joining us. It's a really kind of interesting moment in time. The session we're going to cover today is going to look at different aspects of I'm not able to move the clicker, sorry. Yeah, different aspects of the topic of women in our data, especially today marking World Mental Health Day. We think it's an excellent day to take stock. So what we're going to cover today, I'm going to be looking at the wider context, setting the scene with the context of a widening gender divide and its implications, and how we should intentionally stop and focus. Matt is going to look into the meat of our evidence for the day from the Ipsos Iris tool, we're going to look at women in lots of different facets of their online world. Firstly, as consumers, are we indeed holding all the cards or bearing the cost? We're going to then move into a space of taking care, which is particularly pertinent for today from a mental health perspective. We're going to look at the parenting gap and how we can potentially rewire gender codes for the benefit of all, men and women alike. And then finally, I'm going to come back in and take you home to give you some concrete advice in terms of what can you actually do? So digging into some of our wider marketing effectiveness data and the database work that we do on the creative and content side, how can we help you in your business find the win-win for both society and for business? So without further ado, let's kick off. So why are we here? I think it's really important to ground everything that we're saying today in some of the wider macro context. And the benefit of working at a company like Ipsos is that we have a really holistic understanding of people as citizens, as consumers, as people. And one of the things that we have observed from a macro social perspective is that while tensions in the UK remain high, we do see that they're easing across lots of different areas like, leavers and remainers. But the one area where things are getting a little bit more divisive is in the gender space. And as an accompaniment to this, there's also a growing increase in the share of the British public who say that they're scared to speak out and advocate for the equal rights of women because of what might happen to them. So a whopping plus 107% since 2017 are worried about backlash. There's this growing kind of fear of talking about the issues, but we think it's important to do so. And I hope the next few slides will set out the context on why we think it's important to address these wider contextual challenges. In our Ipsos Global Trends work, we've seen that in GB, 29% agree that the main role for a woman is to be a good wife and a mother. Now, this particular statistic in itself is not as interesting or kind of mic drop, kind of surprising as the actual trend, because this is what matters, that how things are changing over time. And what we see is that in GB, we see an increase in agreement with this statement rather than what you might expect over the last 10 years, which would be a decrease as we maybe are feeling more sort of, as things are getting more progressive. And in fact, we see that even in markets like Sweden, which we traditionally hold up as sort of bastions of progressive behavior, this kind of very traditional view of women is on the rise there as well. And to add an additional layer, we expect that things will start to normalize from the bottom, and we often expect that the youth are sort of typically more socially liberal, but not in all areas. And particularly on the space of gender, what we see is that you're more likely to agree with this statement if you are the age of 16 to 24 than if you're 45 plus. And we've noted a significant increase as well in this traditional perspective of a woman's role growing amongst younger people in GB over the last 3 to 4 years. And ultimately, gender straitjackets are unhealthy for everybody. So while we are particularly going to focus today on women, their digital lives, at the end of the day, these sort of very traditional portrayals of women, these very traditional spaces, and how we code masculine and feminine in a sort of zero-sum game perspective is not healthy for anybody. And actually, we alongside traditional views of women, we also see that traditional views of men are on the rise. So, if you are a Gen Z or millennial man, you're more likely to hold a very traditional view compared to a baby boomer. So you're more likely to agree with the statement, a man who stays at home to look after his children is less of a man. So what's actually going on here? And when we look at some of the there seems to be this sort of vacuum. There's these sort of entrenching of the gender divide and gender codes. And, people like Andrew Tate are just sort of reflections of bad actors who come to occupy the space. But when you look at how favorable he is amongst sort of 16 to 29-year-olds, 21% of 16 to 29-year-old men have a favorable view of Andrew Tate. And that's not a small proportion. That's a good fifth. So it's really, I hope these kind of, this context sheds a light on why we think it's really important that we look at our online spaces and we look at our marketing and we look at our wider landscape to see how we can claim some of it back and create a slightly more equitable future. And now Matt is going to look at a deep dive really on the digital life of women. So I'm going to hand over to him.
Lovely. Thank you, Samira. So we wanted to look at how gender plays out on the internet. Do we see these gender roles manifesting in people's online lives? So firstly, we're going to look at how women spend their time and potentially their money online. So women make up 51% of the total online population in the UK, but they account for 54% of all time spent online. That's across all internet users aged 15 plus on those smartphones, tablets, PCs, and laptops that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, that may not sound like the biggest margin, but that is the equivalent to an extra 34 minutes online every day. And that stacks up to around 17 to 18 hours longer online each month. So that's quite a significant amount of time. There's a lot you can pack into on the internet in 18 hours. As a result, we see women spend more time on more categories online. So here, we're looking at the 24 top-line categories that we measure in the Ipsos Iris platform, and whether women account for an above or below average share of time spent on these categories compared to men. And we can see that women spend more time on 14 of them, compared to just 10 for men. Now, the biggest skew comes at the top there for the likes of homes and property, retail, games, and health. Whereas for men, in red at the bottom, it's gambling, automotive, and sports, where we see the greatest skew for time spent. Three categories that I think it's fair to say before the advent of the internet, you'd have thought was more stereotypically male. We haven't seen this particularly shift online. Over the next few slides, we're going to focus on one category in particular, and that's retail. When we break this down into its component parts, we can see that women spend more time on 20 out of the 27 retail subcategories that we measure in Iris. So that encompasses the likes of fashion, style and beauty, flower shopping, health, books, pets, consumer electronics, restaurants, movies, cinema. What I'm trying to convey is it's a very broad array of retail subcategories that women spend more time on relative to men. In most of those that I listed, substantially more time is spent by women than men. Quite quickly, we're seeing that women are more active online in general, and they're more active online shoppers. I should probably carefully couch that second statement that I'm saying they're spending more time on shopping sites and apps, not necessarily saying that women are making more purchases online than men. Now, we can, of course, go another level down and look at individual brands. And you'll probably be spotting a bit of a pattern by now, because women spend more time on 8 out of the top 10 biggest retail brands online in the UK. So if you look at the top line there, you can see that covers the likes of Amazon, Apple, Argos, Temu, these big, seemingly ubiquitous brands that I don't think are a particularly gendered proposition, all skew towards women. In some cases, quite heavily so, looking at the likes of Temu. In fact, women spend more time on 20 out of the top 25 biggest online retailers. So that 8 out of 10 figure, that 80%, persists some way beyond just the top 10. So obviously, this makes women a very valuable group for retail brands. And for women, this buying power should give them greater precedence. Things like customer and user experience should be built knowing that, for many brands, women are the majority user. But the question is there also a cost to this perception of women as shoppers? Because in Iris, as well as tracking everything our panelists do online, we also have an extensive questionnaire that they fill in to give us rich profiling information about the online population. This will give us things like demographics, characteristics, attitudes, as well as some offline information, such as if they're the main shopper in their household. Now, this reveals that just over 2/3 of women identify as the main shopper of all or most of the items in their household, compared to just under half of men. So it appears that women generally take on greater responsibility for more of the household purchasing. And then on the right, you can see how this gap between men and women increases with age. Now, I think you'd expect to be more about more about generation rather than age. That gender roles are more present, arguably more defined for previous generations like baby boomers. So we're seeing the impact of that, the echoes of these sentiments in our data. However, as we saw in those context slides that Samira showed at the beginning, we can't simply assume that these gender roles will diminish with each generation. There are indications, there are signals in some of the data we have at Ipsos to suggest that these gender roles may be present amongst Gen Z and millennials too. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on over the next few years. Now, we can also see the impact of things like life stage as the gap between men and women widens with marriage or cohabitation. Men who are living with their partner are less likely to identify as the main shopper in their household. Now, admittedly, this isn't necessarily new news, as it's something that retailers and grocery brands in particular have known for decades, that women often have more purchasing power in their household. That's why, until very recently, the likes of Iceland literally had the tagline, "That's why mums go to Iceland," because they identified women, or in their case more specifically mums, as being their core customer. That's where the buying power lies. But there's a bit of a fine line between power and responsibility. Because when we look at the top 10 grocery brands online, we can see on the left that all 10 have a majority female audience. You can see that blue wave all the way from Co-op Food at the bottom to Ocado at the top. And on the right, we can see the skew becomes even more exaggerated for 7 of the 10 brands when we look at time spent. Now, when we shared a previous deck at an internal session a few weeks ago, we had a bit of a discussion with the wider team about some of the data we'd shared. And this slide here, it came up because both men and women in the room were asking if this is actually a product of how men and women shop. There was a suggestion that when men do the grocery shopping, they may be a bit more perfunctory, shall we say. They're using the favourites, they're following the usual recipes, they're trying to get things done as quickly as possible. Compared to women who, again, people in the room were saying, might be a bit more likely to shop around, compare prices, and try new recipes. Now, of course, it is worth acknowledging that within this data, there will be nuances, there'll be proof points, there will be these exceptions, there will be individual stories. But on the whole, it looks like women are much more likely to be doing the grocery shop than men. Nonetheless, on the back of that discussion, we went on to look at the number of grocery brands that men and women visit each month. And we can see that on average, women visit a higher number than men, i.e. they are more likely to visit Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrison, and Asda online, all four of them, in 1 month than men are. We can also see on the right that women are more likely to visit the grocery category on a higher number of days each month than men. So in addition to the previous slide, where we can see women make up the majority of the audience, they account for more time spent on grocery, we can also see that they visit a higher number of grocery brands for a higher number of days each month. So across those 4 data points, we can be pretty confident this isn't just how men and women are shopping, but the responsibility of putting the grocery shop and putting the food in the cupboard sits more on women's shoulders. We can see that again, this gap between men and women widens when we look specifically at people who are partnered and living with children in the household. So we seem to be seeing some evidence of some of these gender roles we were talking about between men and women. These roles appear to be more exaggerated with parenthood. Now, another area where we see evidence of gender roles online is around the idea of taking care. That's of women taking care of others, as well as taking care of themselves. So in the careers category, for example, we can see that men and women make up half the audience for careers online. But women are underrepresented when it comes to engagement. That's probably worth clarifying that here by careers we mean LinkedIn, of course, a huge part of how people manage their career online these days, how they network, but also job and recruitment sites like Indeed, that's the biggest brand on that side of things, as well as Total Jobs, Reed, Glassdoor, and so on. So across these kinds of brands, as I say, we're seeing parity for audience, for reach, but we're seeing an imbalance when it comes to time spent. And when we break this down by age, we can see that the gap is widest between the ages of 25 and 44. Now, this is, of course, where the majority of people will begin cohabiting, marrying, and possibly starting a family. Now, we can see while the gap does shrink after this point, so for over 45s, engagement rate remains skewed towards men as you head towards retirement age. So it looks like parenthood might be having a lasting impact on this gap, something we can explore a bit more on the next slide. So here, we're looking at the average time spent on career sites and apps each month by men and women, and how that's affected by parenthood. So on the left-hand side, you have that all men line in dark green, and you have male parents, dads, in pale green. Now you can see there is quite a big gap between men and male parents at age 18 to 24. Though it is worth pointing out there's a relatively small sample here, because obviously we're seeing fewer parents in that age bracket these days. But after this point, the lines are essentially the same, i.e. parenthood doesn't seem to have an effect on men's online engagement with careers. In fact, there are 2 points where male parents, dads, are spending more time on the careers category than the all men bucket. Whereas on the right, for women, and I have to be careful not to overfit a narrative here, because you can see it absolutely narrows. But there is a gap between mums and the all-women pot all the way from 18 until we reach 55. So parenthood seems to have a greater effect and a more prolonged effect on women's online engagement with careers than it does for men. Now, we can, of course, visualize this in a slightly different way and put both mums and dads on the same chart. And this shows that after the age of 25 to 34, women's engagement with the careers category steadily decreases, while men's engagement enjoys several surges. So the gap between the two becomes a lot more stark when we put them on the same axis. Something else that we saw in the data when we were looking at it is that women are more likely to be in part-time employment than men. But even when we account for that and look specifically at parents in full-time employment, as we have done on this chart, there's almost no difference. You may not have noticed that I changed the chart if I hadn't told you. So employment status, employment type, doesn't seem to be a factor in this gap. Now, of course, just because women spend less time in their careers online, we're in no way saying they are less interested in their career or career progression in general. Not least because within our own data, we can also see that in the first half of the year, women were more likely to be making online searches around terms like salary and pay rise. So that'll be searches of things like average salary in a position or a field, or perhaps how to negotiate a pay rise. It's perhaps worth mentioning that we used our own sort of proprietary AI software called Ipsos Facto to help clean up some of this data, to remove references to things like Pep Guardiola's salary, or the salary of Sue Gray and Keir Starmer, which might have came up once or twice over the last month or so. So what we should be looking at here is searches pertaining to the individual, to their own lives. Now, concerningly, women were also much more likely to be searching for burnout. Another indicator, albeit obviously a very negative one, that women are no less engaged in their career than men. But it's also worth pointing out there could be two forces at work here. The first and most obvious is, of course, that women are more likely to be experiencing burnout, hence they're more likely to search for it, looking for what the symptoms are and how to alleviate them. But another factor, though, is the perception or the idea that women are better at taking care of themselves than men. If they are feeling the effects of something, here burnout, they're more likely to take action. This is something we see evidence of, we see symptoms of online as well. Because if we take a bit of a sidestep to the health category, we can see that the pattern that we see for burnout echoes what we see with engagement across health in general. Women spend much more time overall on the category, whether that's on general health on the left, which will cover medical sites and apps like the NHS and WebMD, or their physical fitness in the middle there, which will cover fitness trackers like Fitbit and Strava, as well as gyms and fitness content. For both, the skew is 60-40 in favour of women for time spent. Then on the right-hand side there, we see the greatest imbalance of all, where women account for more than 8 in every 10 minutes on sites and apps for mental health and well-being. This will be mental health content on the NHS. It'll be charity websites, support sites like Mind or the Mental Health Foundation, as well as meditation and mental health apps like Headspace and Calm. Now, that's quite a broad cross-section, but we've kept them together because in all cases, whether we're talking about mindfulness or mental health support, that 80-20 split is pretty consistent. Now, I'm aware I'm saying this in the context of World Mental Health Day, but obviously a lot has been done over the last decade or two to destigmatize mental health and encourage conversations around it, particularly for young men. And while we can see the gap in engagement is smaller for younger men, it's still very sizable. Women account for 3/4 of engagement on mental health and well-being for 18 to 34-year-olds. And for over 55s, women make up the vast majority of time spent on their mental health. Now, as I said, a lot has been done to destigmatize mental health and get people to talk about it. It's concerning to see there may be a big gap in people reading about it too. That even in the private bubble of the internet, on your personal device, on your mobile phone, on your laptop, there's such a disparity in access between men and women. As we can see here in terms of spending time on the category, but also if we look once more at search data. Here, we're looking at some of the most common search terms around mental health. So anxiety, depression, and mental health itself. And we can see that women make up the majority of people searching for all three terms. So if we take anxiety, for example, what we're saying is, in the first 6 months of this year, women accounted for almost 3/4 of people searching for terms on search engines like anxiety, or as I say, related terms to anxiety. And that's why I think in the framing of the session today, we're careful to underline how gender roles are unhealthy for all, because they're detrimental to both men and to women. Now, we've done a lot of comparison today between men and women, often broken down by age and life stage. But in IRIS, as I alluded to earlier in the introduction, we have a lot of profiling information, and that allows us to look at how this data is affected by intersectionality, for example. So we have looked at how some of the data we've seen today is affected by ethnicity. But in IRIS, at least, we can't see ethnicity driving significant differences in online behavior in the categories we've focused on today. That's not to say we wouldn't see them elsewhere. But what we can see is that sexual orientation has an effect on access to mental health and well-being content. So here, we look at the monthly reach of mental health and well-being sites and apps. I think two things stand out. The first on the left is that the reach in this category is higher amongst LGBT+ men and women, though it's also worth noting that there's still a gap between men and women in the LGBT+ community too. But the other thing that I think stands out is on the right there, is that straight men are being somewhat left behind. They're the lowest number on this chart. Now, is this because straight men are under-engaging, or that they're being underserved? Now, similar questions emerge. We break this down by parents and non-parents. So again, we see there's a gap between men and women with no children in the household on the left, and those with children in the household on the right. But not for the first time today, we can see that parenthood increases the gap between men and women. Now, is that because the strains of parenthood sit more on women? Even today, we've seen they're more likely to be the main shopper in the household. They're spending less time engaging with their careers online. Or is it because they're making sure to look after themselves during the trials of parenthood? We've also just seen that men are less good at doing so, at least from what we can see online. Now, the answer to that question is likely somewhere in between the two. But you could also argue it doesn't really matter, because both are symptoms of the same thing, of those gender roles we discussed and outlined at the top of the presentation, of that gender straitjacket that Samira talked about. So the solution to both would hopefully be the same, to remove the straitjacket and challenge some of these roles. So I'm now going to hand back over to Samira, who will talk in a bit more detail about what some of the solutions might look like for those of you in the audience today.
Thank you, Matt. So now I'm going to take you through some concrete ideas around what you can do in your daily life and in your business environment, but how can we kind of work together to find the win-win for society and business. So the first step is that, it's really about knowing your audience. It's crucial that we fully understand who our audience is. As you could see, so many interesting insights from Matt's data that you cannot make assumptions, and it's really important to see that you have fully explored them as individuals and are meeting their needs. So, in the areas that we've looked at today, it looks like women are currently potentially underserved by the career side. So what additional online resources could be offered for young mums, for example? And likewise, we saw that in the mental health space, engagement amongst men concerningly still lags far behind. And we know that sort of suicide, for example, is a leading cause of death for men under the age of 50. More can be done in this space to understand how can we kind of tailor the resources to be more engaging, but also best serve men as well. So it's really important that some of the decoding that we do on the internet and online and in our wider marketing spaces will help serve both genders if we can get it right. And we've only really scratched the surface today in terms of the areas that we see and the challenges and opportunities for both genders. But focusing specifically on women, I want to give you a few thought starters and provocations to get the juices flowing in terms of thinking about women slightly differently in terms of tailoring your content or online spaces. So in the IRIS data, women aged 15 to 34 spend significantly more time on tech sites than men their age. And, this does not fit necessarily the mold of how you would see the Silicon Valley tech space, for example. So it's just something to think about in terms of how having that insight front and center in terms of developing sort of edgy and more tech, your tech offering. 55 plus women spend twice as much time on games online versus men their age. Again, another potentially stereotype defying fact. And then when it comes to sports, there's only a 6 percentage point gap in the audience by gender for sports content online. But when you look at the engagement, the gender gap by time spent is 59 percentage points in favor of men. So is that by nature or is that by design? We really need to think about, is there something to be done in terms of making these online spaces more welcoming and tailored to engage women more, because they are going and they are the reach is there, but the engagement is not. So there might be some deficiencies in the space that we need to address to make sure it's a more equitable experience for everybody. The second thing is particularly pertinent for our sort of clients in the marketing space, and that's about knowing showing your audience. So it's how do we lead by example and create content that challenges and breaks stereotypes. The marketing space has a lot to answer for over the years. This is a sample draw of sort of very old, arcane ads, from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they're kind of shocking in terms of how they depict not just female characters but male characters as well. But I honestly I could pull so many examples that are way more contemporary, but we wanted to kind of stay focused at the task at hand and not get into any arguments about it. But the truth be told, it persists today, because when we look at our gender equality measure database and we look at advertising and how women turn up in creative, we're still quite far behind in terms of more non-traditional portrayals of women. If you look at how women are portrayed as athletes, STEM professional, business owners, artists, all in the single digits in terms of percentage of how they're portrayed. Predominantly it's sort of wives or girlfriends, and the most common place you'd find a woman in an ad is in the kitchen or living room. Again, a lot of opportunity, plenty of headroom to really kind of break some of the traditional stereotypes. And the second point we want to land is about, you can take an intentional role in avoiding perpetuating power dynamics. Brunel University, in collaboration with Starling Bank, did a study which looked at how women are sort of portrayed on the internet, looking at different photographs in articles about money and finance. And broadly, they found men and women were depicted very differently. Men were shown as being in control, making financial decisions, generally being portrayed with more agency, while you saw women turning up in these pictures, pinching pennies and saving, putting pennies in piggy banks, and generally slightly infantilizing their role in the financial space. So, just kind of being very intentional about not perpetuating these power dynamics in the imagery or tonality that you use. And then, it's just the deletion of women. It's taken a very long time at to get gender parity in terms of how women and men are represented, or how much women and men are represented as main characters in the Cannes Lion film and Filmcraft creative work from 2006 to 2021. We've only just about reached parity, and there's plenty more work to be done in this space. So, thinking actively about the deletion of women. So particularly, you saw the stat about the engagement with tech, for example. Make sure that we are not deleting women in spaces where they're particularly engaged as well. And finally, grow your audience. There's a really compelling and very commercial reason to take a more progressive stance, to take a more kind of active stance towards moving towards gender equality in terms of how we show up and decoding the internet and other spaces by gender. Because what we've seen when it comes to advertising specifically and marketing, that when you have stronger gender equality scores, you have stronger kind of commercial potential as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the gender equality measure is. So in any of the content that we test at Ipsos through our Creative Spark approach, we measure how the main character is portrayed, if they're a man or a woman. We look at gender portrayal and kind of see if they're presented well, if they're shown respectfully, do they turn up in an appropriate way? Can they be seen as a role model as well? So we do this for this measurement for male as well as female characters in media, and it's really our goal to kind of look at identifying gender bias in media, or like looking at the themes to help our clients make better content. So when you have a strong gender equality measure score, so looking at female portrayal as a start point, when you have higher gender equality measure scores with female portrayal, your ad is 32% more likely to drive strong sales lift. So this is based on our creative effect index. And it's validated to market mix modeling using client supplied data. So it's a really robust measure of your likelihood of sales lift in market. So you get strong business effects for like short-term business effects, but it also helps you drive stronger brand equity effect. So the likelihood that you're going to grow your equity share versus your category in the next 6 months, you get strong longer term business effects as well. So progressive female portrayal is good for business. And continuing on the theme that it's not a zero-sum game, we can look at it both sides. Progressive male portrayal is good for business too. So when we do non-traditional portrayal of men in the media and in content, again, you see the strong potential to drive both short-term as well as long-term business effects for your brand or service. So, there is no kind of reason not to do it because it's a win-win across the board. So just to sum up, the 3 things that you can take away from today and tangibly apply to your business practice: know your audience, really understand your users and their needs. Have you fully explored their lives and their interests as people without, reflecting age-old stereotypes that may exist? Show your audience, be quite intentional about how you're reflecting people turning up. Rely on the facts, not what has gone before, to inform your decisions. And finally, grow your audience, because progressive portrayal does pay. I have shown you examples from a sort of creative standpoint, but I do honestly believe that they're pretty generalizable to other parts of experience and engagement and growing business across different, by growing your audiences and making spaces more welcoming for everybody. And this will help kind of decode gender more widely for everybody as well. So yes, just instead of calling each other out, let's call each other in and come together for gender balance. So I think that's pretty much the session from Matt and I today. And we've left a little bit of time as well for any questions that might be coming from the audience. We'd be very happy to take them.
Yes, we have a couple of questions, and so feel free, either of you, to kind of jump in, unmute, and let me know if you have the answers to those. So first, we're looking at a question on what if my business is concerned around stepping into social issues, and is there a nervousness in the industry around that?
I can probably take that one. Yes, and I do. I mean, you've seen the nervousness of backlash growing amongst the general public, and marketers are a subset of the population, and I can completely understand this fear of backlash. And I think the automatic assumption is, when you think about unstereotyping spaces or content or any of that, is to jump straight to activism. I just want to reflect on the fact that that is a valid path. But if your brand is not there and you're worried about backlash, there is a whole spectrum of action available to you. And, before you jump to that perspective and really kind of dig your heels in, have you also kind of done the hard yards in terms of just getting your house in order and doing the basics? And there's an ability to do that with joy and levity and humor, and there's plenty of ways that we can help you as well kind of work through some of those challenges. There are pathways to it that are relevant to your brand. So I would say, the path into how to land it well without wading into the culture wars per se, if that's helpful. Yeah.
Fantastic. We've got another one coming in around the robustness of the online data. Matt, you may want to mention or discuss, I guess, where the data comes from and UCOM's role in it, just in terms of how it's industry endorsed, would be great.
Yes, as I said at the beginning, we are endorsed by UCOM, that's the UK Online Measurement Board, And I was very succinct to my summary, but as I say, all the data comes from a panel of over 10,000 people. We have software installed across all the devices they have, their smartphone, their tablet, PC and laptop, and that tracks every tap, every click that they make on their device. Gives us an incredibly rich passive data set that we can do some very exciting and jazzy things with. And as I say, that's combined then with census data, with tags on some of the hundreds of the biggest websites and apps in the UK. I normally do a hand action to implement or indicate data science kind of happening as they're kind of fusing those two together. And as I say, then combining that with some very rich profiling information, a few other kind of bells and whistles. But yeah, obviously we
Fantastic. And another one for you, Matt, on your section around the searches for burnout. Could that be someone searching on behalf of someone else? How do we differentiate that within the data set?
That is a good question. I think I said there were two factors at play on that slide, but that could be a third factor, of course, and a kind of another dimension to that element of kind of women taking care. I said about taking care of themselves, but also taking care of others. So it's not just children, but also potentially their partner or someone else in their family or household. So yeah, absolutely, that could be the case that people are searching, as I say, on behalf of someone else. It'd be quite hard to separate quickly at a high level who's doing that, but I think we definitely get into the weeds of the data, that passive data set that I just mentioned, and take 10 or 20 respondents and see kind of what they're doing the week or two before making that search, the week or two after, and kind of piece together almost like a piece of qual, sometimes how we treat it, of like an individual journey, individual story of what does it look like for that person, and find perhaps cases where we can see that, whoever's making the search, be it man or woman, if they're searching on behalf of someone else, and kind of seeing what the implications of that are and kind of what they're doing in order to get that help for someone else. But yeah, it's a good question.
And I think we briefly cut out slightly on audio there at the end of your previous question, Matt, but I'll direct people towards both our website, irs.ipsos.com, as well as the UCOM website for more information on the methodology and how the endorsement and data is sourced and worked on. There's another question here come in. Did anything surprise you about the research findings? It seems to follow where the world is headed in terms of gender profiles and equality. I'll let either of you jump in for that one.
Do you mean that it's kind of slipping and looking a little bit heading towards a more traditional space rather than a non-traditional space? Yeah, I know it's kind of sad to think that every time we think we've come a long way. I think there's a lot of it's been quite a political debate, I think, in the last 10 years as well. A lot of it, divisiveness has been weaponized a little bit. So I think we are all, and we've been through, a pandemic, a polycrisis, and people are looking for also psychological safety and nostalgia. We know from our global trends, again, is a big theme and trend emerging from this. We know that people are more worried than they've ever been. We haven't been this worried in Britain since the oil crisis in the 70s. That kind of thing. So there is a kind of temptation to kind of retreat to more traditional values, which also may be playing into this. But there is also kind of a rise of very misogynistic content, for example, that's driving some of this. So I think there's a culmination of lots of symptoms, factors, but I think I really believe in the power of marketing as a way of, and all of our online kind of owned spaces as a way of reclaiming and decoding some of these effects. Ultimately, if you are in the marketing or policy business, you are in the business of serving people or kind of reflecting back to them what is aspirational. So in that sense, we cannot be holding up a mirror to society. There's an opportunity to kind of, we are shaping it. So there's an opportunity to kind of normalize and change some of these trends.
Brilliant. I know we're at time, but people are still hanging on, so I think we can press through because we've got a couple more questions come in. One person, just to check, will the deck be available after this presentation? Yes, if you registered, then you should have an email as soon as the recording is ready. And if not, and you found yourself here, which I know some of you have, the deck will be shared either through your Ipsos Iris account manager, or alternatively through the Ipsos and the Ipsos Iris website, and through Samira's team as well, I'm sure. And then a further question, are you planning any other sessions like this using Iris data on topics or demographics and audiences? Matt, I suppose?
It's not even a plant, that question. Yes, I think today is hopefully the beginning of the conversation. I think any of the topic areas that we covered, health, careers, retail as well, you could do a deep dive into any of those. And we're already talking about potentially starting with health. It's hot off the press, so don't hold me to that if you don't see it super quick. But yes, we're carrying on this conversation. The intention is to keep kind of expanding the work that we've done here. We also want to look a bit more kind of demographics, so what young people look like online, what Gen Z are doing, what sets them apart from kind of older demographics, and also vice versa, kind of what can we learn about how older people are behaving, and hopefully kind of bust some myths in that space too. So yes, intention is to do lots of work around demographics in the future, both under the umbrella of kind of the women in our data, kind of diving deeper into a few areas there, but also, as I say, exploring kind of how age affects use of the internet and the online space too.
Fantastic. And I think a final question for people really hanging on to get all the questions answered here. Do we have any data around single parent households, whether that be search data or general Iris data?
So I think that's something we would be able to get to from the data. I think we'd be able to, if not know, then certainly heavily infer. So something that we didn't necessarily focus on today. It did come up in discussions because we're kind of looking at the gender divide within a household, but absolutely we could look at that too. And I'd say that's something we did talk about when we're putting this presentation together. Following on from that last question, we're aware that I don't want to call today the tip of the iceberg, because hopefully it's a standalone piece in and of itself, but there's so many ways we could take this, so many different kind of strands we could pull at. So that is certainly one of them, of seeing the differences between kind of male or female-led single-parent households, for example. So yeah, there's lots of avenues to explore, and we'll obviously keep you all posted with how we do that in the months ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you both for your time today, and thank you for everyone for holding on in the room and watching it. I hope you found this really informative, and we will of course make sure that the next time we run one of these, which will be hopefully very soon, and on, I'm sure, another fascinating topic, you will be among the first to know. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Samira Brophy. Thank you to Matt Patchett, and looking forward to seeing you all again soon.